May 4th, 1799. The fortress city of Seringapatam. General David Baird, scarred from years in Tipu Sultan's dungeons, raised his telescope toward the massive walls. 20 years of hatred burned in his eyes. Beside him, a young colonel named Arthur Wellesley, future Duke of Wellington, watched British artillery pound the ancient stones into rubble. Inside those crumbling walls, the Tiger of Mysore prepared to make his final stand. For 2 decades, Tipu Sultan had terrorised British forces with his rockets, defied every attempt at conquest, and sworn jihad against the expanding empire. He had Napoleon's backing, French military advisors, and 30,000 fanatical soldiers. The British had 4,000 men and one decisive advantage. Someone inside Seringapatam was about to commit the ultimate betrayal. This is the story of Seringapatam, the siege where Britain crushed its most dangerous enemy in India. The day a young Wellington learned from humiliating failure, the lessons that would make him Europe's greatest general, and the moment when treachery opened the gates for British steel. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering the siege that secured British dominance in southern India, the victory that eliminated Britain's most dangerous enemy and established the foundation for the jewel in the imperial crown. But before we watch British forces storm the seemingly impregnable walls of Seringapatam, before we see Tipu Sultan make his final stand against impossible odds, we need to understand how Britain came to face its most formidable opponent in the exotic battlefields of southern India. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. We cover the battles that built the British Empire, the victories won through courage, discipline, and superior leadership in the most challenging corners of the world. The Fourth Anglo-Mysore War had been building for years. Tipu Sultan, ruler of Mysore since 1782, represented everything that threatened British expansion in India. Unlike other Indian princes who could be negotiated with, bribed, or intimidated, Tipu was an implacable enemy who understood exactly what British success would mean for Indian independence. Tipu had inherited both throne and hatred of the British from his father, Hyder Ali, who had fought 3 previous wars against East India Company expansion. But where Hyder had been pragmatic, Tipu was ideological. He saw British rule as an existential threat to Islamic civilization in India and conducted his resistance accordingly. This wasn't merely territorial dispute, it was civilizational conflict. The Tiger had modernized Mysore's military with systematic efficiency that impressed even his enemies. French advisors helped reorganize his army along European lines. His arsenal produced rockets whose range and accuracy exceeded anything the British possessed. His fortifications incorporated the latest military engineering. Most dangerously, he'd established diplomatic relations with revolutionary France and later Napoleon, creating the possibility of French military intervention in India just as Britain faced its greatest challenge in Europe. By 1799, Tipu controlled territory from the western coast of India to the approaches of Madras, commanding trade routes and resources that made him potentially as wealthy as the East India Company itself. His capital, Seringapatam, was a fortress city on an island in the Cauvery River, protected by massive walls, dangerous approaches, and a garrison of elite troops fanatically loyal to their sultan. Governor-General Richard Wellesley, Arthur's older brother, understood that Tipu's continued independence made British control of southern India impossible. As long as the Tiger lived, British allies would doubt Company strength, British enemies would seek his support, and the entire imperial structure in India would remain vulnerable to challenge. The decision for war was fundamentally strategic. Britain could not consolidate Indian conquests while facing a powerful, hostile, and ideologically committed enemy who commanded substantial resources and maintained connections with European rivals. Tipu had to be eliminated not just as a military threat, but as a symbol of successful resistance to British rule. Richard Wellesley assembled the largest army the company had ever deployed in India. Nearly 50,000 troops, including British regiments, company forces, sepoy battalions, and allied contingents from Hyderabad and the Marathas. 4,000 British soldiers formed the core of this enormous force, professional troops whose discipline and firepower would prove decisive. Command was divided between General George Harris, overall commander, and his subordinates, including David Baird, whose personal hatred of Tipu Sultan was legendary. Baird had been Tipu's prisoner for 4 years after the Battle of Polila, chained in dungeons and subjected to humiliations that left him burning for revenge. When his mother was told her son was chained like a wild animal, she reportedly replied that she was sorry for the chain that had to hold him. Arthur Wellesley commanded a division in this campaign, his first major independent command, and the experience that would shape his understanding of siege warfare, logistics, and the coordination of diverse military forces. But the young colonel would learn these lessons the hard way. Early in the siege, his overconfident night attack on the Sultan Peta Tope Grove ended in humiliating failure. Panicked soldiers, scattered formations, and Wellesley himself wounded and lost in the darkness. The defeat taught him the critical importance of reconnaissance and careful preparation, principles that would define every subsequent campaign. Everything he learned at Seringapatam, through both failure and success, would reappear in his later victories across Europe. The siege began in April 1799 with methodical British efficiency. Rather than rush the assault, Harris invested Seringapatam completely, cutting off supplies, reinforcements, and communication. British engineers surveyed the fortifications, identifying weak points and planning approaches. Artillery batteries were positioned with mathematical precision to create breaches in the massive walls. Tipu's defences were formidable. Seringapatam's walls rose nearly 30 feet above the river, constructed of stone blocks fitted so precisely that cannonballs often bounced off without creating significant damage. The fortress contained sufficient supplies for a lengthy siege, workshops for manufacturing weapons and ammunition, and a garrison of experienced soldiers who had defeated British armies before. But Tipu faced a fundamental strategic problem. Unlike previous Anglo-Mysore wars, he was completely isolated. The Marathas, previously his allies, had joined the British. Hyderabad was actively supporting British operations. No French assistance was available. Napoleon was campaigning in Egypt and Syria, unable to spare forces for India. The Mysore army was alone against overwhelming numbers with no prospect of relief. The British approach combined systematic siege warfare with psychological pressure. Rather than attempt immediate assault, Harris allowed artillery bombardment and the reality of isolation to weaken Mysore morale. Desertion increased as soldiers realised their situation was hopeless. Food supplies dwindled despite careful rationing. The constant thunder of British guns created an atmosphere of inevitable defeat. Tipu himself remained defiant throughout the siege, appearing on the walls to encourage his troops, directing counter-battery fire and planning sorties against British positions. European observers noted his personal courage and the loyalty he inspired among his remaining followers. But courage couldn't overcome mathematics. 4,000 British soldiers, supported by superior artillery and unlimited supplies, faced a garrison that was shrinking daily through casualties and desertion. The decisive breakthrough came when British reconnaissance identified a section of wall that could be breached effectively. Concentrated artillery fire opened a gap wide enough for assault columns to penetrate. The breach was still dangerous, defended by determined troops fighting for their homeland, but it was practicable for disciplined soldiers willing to accept casualties. General Harris planned the assault with meticulous care. David Baird would lead the main column through the breach, supported by flanking attacks that would prevent Mysore forces from concentrating their defence. Arthur Wellesley commanded reserve forces positioned to exploit success or cover withdrawal if the assault failed. Every detail was rehearsed, every contingency planned. On May 4th, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, British bugles sounded the advance. Baird's column, led by forlorn hope volunteers who understood they would likely die clearing the breach, moved forward under intense fire from Mysore defenders. But as British steel met Indian resistance, rumours of treachery spread through the fortress. Mir Sadiq, Tipu's own minister, had allegedly withdrawn defenders from critical positions under the pretence of distributing pay. While British guns had breached the walls, betrayal from within may have sealed Seringapatam's fate. The assault was brutal, immediate, and decisive. British discipline and training overcame desperate resistance as soldiers climbed through gaps in the wall, fighting hand-to-hand with the remaining defenders. Tipu Sultan, witnessing the fall of his outer defences, made a choice that defined his historical legacy. Rather than flee or surrender, he took up his weapons and joined the fighting personally. European accounts describe him moving through the breach area, sword in hand, rallying his remaining soldiers for a final stand against the British advance. The fighting inside Seringapatam was fierce but brief. British soldiers trained in close combat and supported by superior numbers systematically cleared the fortress. Mysore resistance collapsed as organised defence became impossible. Individual acts of courage couldn't compensate for tactical collapse and overwhelming enemy superiority. Tipu Sultan died, fighting in the gateway of his own fortress, surrounded by the bodies of soldiers who had remained loyal to the end. British accounts emphasise his personal bravery and the respect he earned even from enemies who had every reason to hate him. He was found among the casualties, identified by his distinctive clothing and the tiger-shaped ornament that gave him his famous nickname. The discovery of Tipu's body ended organised resistance immediately. Mysore soldiers, seeing their sultan dead, laid down their weapons rather than continue hopeless fighting. The fortress was secure, the kingdom was conquered, and British supremacy in southern India was established beyond challenge. The aftermath revealed the enormous wealth Tipu had accumulated through decades of successful rule. British forces discovered treasures worth millions of pounds. Gold, silver, precious stones, weapons decorated with gold and jewels, and artefacts that demonstrated the sophistication of Mysore court culture. The famous Tipu's tiger, a mechanical toy showing a tiger devouring a British soldier, became a symbol of the cultural conflict the siege represented. Arthur Wellesley was appointed administrator of Seringapatam, responsible for organising the conquered territory and establishing British governance. This administrative experience taught him lessons about managing diverse populations, maintaining supply lines across vast distances, and coordinating civil and military authority that would prove invaluable throughout his later career. The strategic consequences of Seringapatam were immediate and profound. With Tipu dead and Mysore conquered, no significant military power remained to challenge British expansion in southern India. The Marathas, who had allied with Britain against Tipu, would face the company's full attention within a few years. Hyderabad became a client state. French influence in India disappeared completely. For British imperial confidence, Seringapatam represented validation of systematic military professionalism over exotic but ultimately inferior opponents. Tipu had been formidable, courageous, intelligent, well-equipped, and absolutely committed to resistance. His defeat proved that British military methods could overcome any challenge when properly applied with sufficient resources and competent leadership. The siege also demonstrated the effectiveness of British-trained sepoy regiments. Indian soldiers fighting for the company performed with discipline and courage throughout the campaign, proving their reliability in operations against Indian enemies. This success validated British confidence in sepoy loyalty and established patterns of recruitment and organisation that would persist throughout the imperial period. David Baird achieved the revenge he had sought for 20 years. The man who had been chained in Tipu's dungeons led the assault that conquered Tipu's capital. His personal triumph symbolised British resilience and the ultimate futility of challenging imperial power. Enemies might achieve temporary victories, but British determination would eventually prevail. For Wellington personally, Seringapatam was the foundation of his military education. He learned siege warfare, colonial administration, and the coordination of diverse military forces. He observed the importance of systematic preparation, the need for reliable intelligence, and the value of maintaining discipline under difficult conditions. Every lesson would prove relevant in his later campaigns against Napoleon. The death of Tipu Sultan eliminated the most formidable enemy British expansion had faced in India. Unlike other Indian rulers who could be managed through alliances, treaties, or client relationships, Tipu had been an existential threat who understood that accommodation with British power meant the end of Indian independence. His elimination cleared the path for complete British domination of the subcontinent. European reactions to Seringapatam were mixed. British celebration was tempered by recognition that a worthy enemy had been defeated rather than a mere obstacle removed. Tipu's courage in death earned respect, even from those who had considered him a dangerous fanatic. French observers noted that Britain had eliminated their potential ally in India, just as the European war was intensifying. The Tiger's famous rockets, which had terrorised British forces in earlier wars, became trophies rather than threats. British engineers studied their construction and incorporated improved designs into Royal Artillery equipment. Innovation that had once challenged British superiority was absorbed and turned to imperial advantage. Mysore itself was partitioned among the victors. British territories expanded significantly, while Allied states received portions that increased their dependence on company protection. The kingdom that had defied British expansion for decades was dismantled systematically, its resources redirected to support further imperial growth. The fortress of Seringapatam was maintained as a British stronghold, its massive walls now protecting company interests rather than challenging them. The island that had been the centre of Mysore power became another link in the chain of fortifications that secured British dominance across southern India. For Indian resistance to British rule, Tipu's death was catastrophic. He had been the most successful opponent of company expansion, demonstrating that European military methods could be adopted and used effectively against European armies. His defeat proved that individual brilliance and personal courage were insufficient against systematic British professionalism, supported by overwhelming resources. The treasure of Seringapatam funded further British expansion across India. Gold and silver that Tipu had accumulated to finance resistance instead paid for the armies that completed British conquest. The irony was profound. Indian wealth financing the destruction of Indian independence. Arthur Wellesley's experience as administrator of conquered Seringapatam taught him colonial governance and the complexities of managing diverse populations under imperial rule. He learned to balance military necessity with political pragmatism, skills that would prove essential when he commanded Allied armies across Europe composed of multiple nationalities with different objectives. The siege established patterns of British military success that would persist throughout the imperial period. Systematic preparation, superior firepower, disciplined assault, and competent leadership could overcome apparently formidable opponents when properly coordinated. These lessons would be applied from Afghanistan to Africa as British power expanded globally. Tipu Sultan's legacy remained complex. British accounts emphasised his fanaticism and cruelty while acknowledging his courage and intelligence. Indian memories preserved him as a hero who died defending his homeland against foreign invasion. Both perspectives contain truth, reflecting the fundamental tragedy of colonial conquest. Worthy opponents destroyed by forces they could not ultimately resist. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the battles that built empires, the sieges where individual courage faced systematic power, the moments when the fate of nations was decided by superior leadership and military professionalism, then you know what to do. These are the stories that demonstrate how British determination and competence established dominance across the globe. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the battles that built an empire, told the way they deserve to be told.